Zombie Critters was written by me, Jesse O'Brien. This is a work of my imagination and fully intended for a mature audience. All content is owned by the author, me, and all similarities to people, businesses, organizations, places, or animals, past, present, or future, is purely coincidental. This story contains graphic critter violence and some strong language. So without further delay, let's begin our story. Chapter 1. Aren't they the cutest things? Zach, Tom, and Gary were doctorate medical students, working on a collective thesis through Franklin College. The three had been working on a formula for months. Tom thought they were getting close. He had just ventilated a plastic container that he used to gas a mouse in the name of science. Now, before you readers close this book and claim this author is all for animal cruelty and torture, read a little further. His study has been an experiment for bringing back an animal within minutes of death. The study was supposed to be a stepping stone from animals to humans. The animals he worked with were sickly to start with and were slated to be euthanized. Rats, cats, dogs, snakes, raccoons, possums, or anything that did not carry the title of Homo sapiens. Zach and Gary joined the study with Tom about a year prior, since they were working on a parallel thesis. Tom had been working on the project for 3 years and had made quite a bit of progress. Combined, they were making even more success. Their goal was to save lives and regenerate tissue, muscle, and nerve cells. Nobel Peace Prize material was a guarantee if they could succeed in their talk. But so far, all they had been successful in doing was to rid the animal shelters of sickly animals and the employees of having to euthanize them. They were picketed once from PETA. They had protested the abuse of the sick animals and the inhumane treatment of having to put them down, claiming that they should not be suffered to be murdered under any circumstances and should be allowed to die naturally. When the investigation was over, it was found that the boys were not doing anything inhumane or criminal. PETA was told to leave them alone after the gas chamber that Tom had designed actually placed the animal to sleep before it was euthanized. After it was over, Tom made a sign for the plastic container that said, "Animal Auschwitz." The moniker was to royally piss off the PETA crowd. It worked. He was assaulted, and his car was spray-painted with murder all over it. Gary had set up surveillance at first contact of PETA. The fine individuals were arrested and prosecuted for criminal mischief, vandalism, and criminal trespassing. It was enough to finally get them to back off. Frustration ranked high while morale was non-existent, while pet and critter carcasses piled up for disposal. Tom checked, adjusted, and tested only to start the process all over again. His formula contained many things, but the one at the top of the list was adrenaline. This chemical was used in drug overdoses and other lethal maladies. His latest actually restarted the heart, only to falter and stop a few seconds later. He was missing something, but was stumped as to what it was. So close, he kept saying. What is missing? He looked at the formula over and over again. Something was missing to jumpstart and kick the heart back to life. Zach and Gary was just as stumped as Tom. Gary came up with a vial and handed it to Tom. "I think we have it," he said. Gary placed the box on top of the table. "Success! I kept tweaking the formula and came up with this." He then opened the box where a small chipmunk was sniffing the air. But it didn't look right. It seemed to act okay, but Tom just couldn't put his finger on it. "We'll observe it for a day or two to see if it survives," Tom said. "If it does work, we'll use it on a bigger animal. How much did you make?" "About 5 gallons. It works best airborne or dripped into the nasal cavity. It's more direct into the bloodstream, and it works just as well as injecting it into the vein. I mean, you can do that too. But less than 35 thousandths of a millimeter brought this little guy back," Gary said. "How long was he flatlined before you introduced the formula?" Tom asked. "About 5 minutes, Gary said. "Amazing. Is it safe?" "Have you exposed any live animals to the formula?" Tom asked, excitement obvious in his voice. "I exposed 10 various species of animals to it, and so far there are no ill effects to living animals, so far I can tell," Gary said. "Great work. This is a huge step toward helping humanity, Tom said. Have you told Zach? We took some of your formula and worked on it in our spare time. This is due to all our research and work, Tom, Gary said humbly. If this continues to be successful, I think we can see a Nobel Peace Prize unless Mr. Gore determines that carbon is a pollutant and learns to use the bigger scissor lift. Let's make it successful first, and this is an awesome start, Tom said. They looked into the box. Tom reached into the box and stated, Cute little thing, isn't he? But he has quite the violent disposition, Gary said. Tom barely got his fingers back when the chipmunk hissed and snapped at him. He's a little surly, isn't he? Was he like this before the formula? I'm not sure. He was pretty sick when I got him. He was almost dead, Gary informed him. How's he with the other animals? Tom queried curiously. Now that is the $64,000 question. Before, he just lay there. Now the others and chipmunks are generally non-aggressive unless pressed to defend themselves. After we administered the formula, he was okay at first, and then one of the others disappeared. We found the carcass, sans the entrails and brain. When Zach reached into the cage for him, he bit Zach. He has a nasty infection, but his doctor says he has a cold or his allergies are acting up again. He goes into sneezing fits, Gary said. He says he'll be back tomorrow. I wonder if he became allergic to all those cats he has, Tom said, laughing. How many does he have now? I think the body count is up to 6 now, Gary said. And he's still single? Maybe he should just get a puppy, Tom chuckled. A puppy? Come on, Tom. The cats would eat it or bat it around like a fuzzy ball, Gary said as they both fell into a round of mirth. Both men studied the chipmunk and the formula. They chambered 3 different species, a large squirrel, a dog, and lastly a parrot. All these subjects were successfully brought back from the dark abyss. There was no noticeable difference in temperament when they came back to life. Tom had noted that it was 3:30. Hey, let's wrap it up and call it a day, Gary. Gary agreed and placed the dog back in the kennel. He was in a hurry and did not recheck the cages and kennels to make sure they were securely fastened like he normally did. The jubilant duo left to celebrate their findings. They also called Zach to meet them at the club, but he didn't answer the phone. They left a message to meet at the outer space for a beer. The celebrating duo drank to this and drank to that, and was soon wobbly and not feeling any pain. After years of search for Tom, with the help of Gary and Zach, they had success. They were going to be on every medical map and journal in the world. They decided to walk to Zach's place to celebrate with him before going home. They climbed the 6 flights of stairs, bouncing from one side to the other, stopping at the top and collapsing in giggling fits on the floor. They gathered themselves and knocked on his door. No answer. He had to be home. It was 2 a.m. Though there was no answer, they gathered that he was asleep and knocked much harder. So hard, in fact, as to draw the wrath of the neighbors. Upon threat of the police, or as the resident stated, "Get out of here, I called the po-pos," they decided to depart as quietly as they came, which really wasn't very quiet if you discount bouncing off the walls up the stairs. Tom and Gary started to walk away, and then Tom stopped and looked at the door. Gary started to speak, but was silenced by Tom with an upraised hand. Tom put his ear against the door and listened. He heard eating, and Tom actually could hear the cats purring. I wonder how long ago he left. Stopped. Checked his syntax. I wonder when he left. The critters are eating. They walked away and gingerly made their way down the stairs away from the building and back to their prospective homes. They all lived within walking distance of both their lab and the bar. This was both coincidental and planned. Coincidence on the location of the bar and planned on the location of the college lab and their lab, so all could save on transportation. Tom, Zach, and Gary had become close friends with similar passions in science and medicine. Tom had been working on a formula for several years in junior college, then continued at the university. All 3 had joined forces for their thesis and their doctor's degrees. Tom and Gary were concerned. Tom called Zach's phone number as soon as he was in his apartment. The phone rang 5 times before going to voicemail. Tom went to bed very sober and very worried about his friend. The phone rang and Tom pulled the pillow over his head. The phone exploded, taking his eardrums with it. He reached for his clock and turned off the offending claxons. but the clock wasn't there. He found the clock on the floor, picked it up, and looked at the solar bright digits, noting that the 1:23 was followed by 2 letters, PM. Just then the phone exploded again with the piercing barbs in his head. He picked up the phone and saw Gary's name blazing brightly on the screen. Chapter 2. What the heck got into those cats? Tom answered the phone with the speaker just inches from his head. Tom, this is Gary. Zach never returned my messages. I'm on my way over there to meet the police for a welfare check. Meet me there in 10, okay? Tom's hangover was the least of his worries now. I'll be right over, he said. He got up, dressed, and left for Zach's apartment, carrying a large bottle of electrolytes. Gary was waiting out front of the building with his hands stuffed nervously deep in his pockets. Tom asked if there was any word. Police told me to wait down here until they return, and return they did. One officer came down and requested a conference. Another passed then, and he was very pale and holding his stomach in his mouth. Could you two come up with me, please? The officer asked. How do you know Zach? He's our friend and fellow research student, sir. We were working on a thesis together. We were in the middle of a medical breakthrough, and we've been working together for a little over 3 years or so, I guess. Why? Gary asked. Well, there's quite a problem. We have a body, or rather, what's left of a body, and 6 very feral cats, the officer stated. Feral cats? Zach never had feral cats. The ones he had played constant lap kitty. There's not a mean bone in their bodies, Gary said. Interesting, the officer said as they entered the apartment. They were overpowered by a stench of death. Blood was everywhere around the body. It looked like a feeding frenzy ensued at some time earlier. On outward appearances, the body was intact, but the stomach was ripped open and the internal organs were gone. It was obviously apparent that they tried to get to the brain cavity with no success. 2 cats lie dead. One was in a cage, and another one was locked in a closet, leaving 2 cats MIA. It had appeared that when he died, however that was, the cats were extremely hungry, and the only sign of foul play was from the cats, the officer said. When we opened the door, we were attacked by his cats. We killed 2, and 2 got out. He pointed at the one dead cat and stopped. Hey, who picked up one of the cats? Tom and Zach looked at each other. Officer, how many of your men were bitten? Zach asked. 3 of my men were bitten. 1 is requiring stitches. Why do you ask? Is there something I should know about? He asked. Nothing that we know of at this time. Can we take a couple blood samples, sir? This is down our line of work. We also need samples from the cats, too, if that's okay, sir, Tom asked. We still haven't determined if this is a murder or not. You could take these damn feral cats with you, but I can't allow you to disturb the body or scene. I'm sure you can appreciate that, he said. Oh, absolutely, sir. No problem, Gary said, scooping the toe of his shoe in Zach's blood. They recovered the 1 dead cat, the 1 in the closet, and the caged wildcat and walked outside. Gary walking as if he had stepped in something foul, he pulled off a shoe as soon as they were outside of the police perimeter. He carried it as careful as he could while carrying the dead cat. They returned to the lab to find mayhem and carnage on a major scale everywhere throughout the lab. There was broken glass everywhere. There were also fluids on the floor, cages stood open, and most were damaged. There were so many bodies and so much blood that Gary thought they'd walked into a butcher shop. Tom had to work to keep the contents of his stomach in check. The dead animals had been torn open and the internal organs devoured. The animals looked at the open door and made a sudden rush for the door. Tom slammed it shut just before 30 different animals of various species rushed outside. Tom looked at Gary. What the hell's going on here, Gary? We have to get to the lab to study the blood that we have and the blood of these inside. This doesn't make any sense at all. I want to know what happened in there. Did someone turn them loose and then butcher them? asked Gary. I don't think so. I think we have the same thing here as at Zach's place, or at least to me it looked very similar. What do you think? Gary nodded, looking at Zach's blood on his shoe. He then looked at Tom. Tears were now streaming down his face. Tom, Zach's gone. The police don't really have a clue if it was murder, but we have a serious problem here. Gary paused while Tom stared incredulously at him, waiting for Gary to state the obvious. If the police see our lab, they will think we're connected to his death somehow. Bam! There it was, the proverbial slap on the forehead. But Gary, we are connected. I'm just not sure how yet, or even how it could possibly have happened, but it did, Tom said. We have to get into that lab. Let's go in the back way and hope they haven't gotten in there. Here's another thought. Don't get bitten. I'm thinking that might have another connection. I need my board. I saw it covered in blood and fur, Gary said. They walked around to the back of the building and unlocked the door. Tom peeked in and listened. Neither one saw or heard anything that they shouldn't be hearing. Tom slipped in and turned on the lights. This part of the lab was untouched by the animals that were just one door away. Tom walked over and secured the door to assure that they could work safely. Gary began turning on various pieces of equipment while Tom secured the doors. Gary drew samples of the blood and placed them on slides and blood typed the other samples to begin the log of just about anything that might be linked to what is going on. When all the equipment was warmed up and running, they began their search. Chapter 3. Eeny, meeny, miny, zombie? The officers that were bitten were treated and released, returning back to work at the station to fill out incident reports on what happened at the apartment. They debated and concurred on all but what made the cats attack like rabid animals. The three turned in their reports and went to their separate domiciles to recuperate and report to desk duty pending the rabies test on the blood taken from the 2 dead cats at the scene. Officer Mike Milligan arrived home and kissed his wife and daughter and pet the family dog. Mike accidentally sneezed and rubbed his nose with his handkerchief. Tank was in the full line of fire and got misted by Mike's expectorate. Tank shook his head and begged for attention. Mike started to feel as if he were coming down with a cold. He took a cold medication, sat on the couch, and dozed off. Mike's wife, Peggy, was cooking supper when Tank lumbered up to beg for food. Sadie sat mixing a cake in a bowl for Mom while watching the exchange between Mom and Tank. Mom slipped Tank a piece of meat after she sat up and performed another trick for the meat. It was funny watching Tank sit up for his treat. Tank was a 65-pound black boxer with a white mask and white toes. He still had his tail and it wagged excitedly. After about 20 minutes, Mom had given Tank 4 treats. Then Tank sat up and grunted. Mom said, "Okay, boy, last treat for now." He took it and dropped down to all 4 feet where he spit the meat on the floor. He looked up at Peggy and grunted. "No more, boy." Then she looked down at Tank. "Aren't you feeling well, boy? You look different all of a sudden." She reached out her hand, noting that there was a change in Tank's eyes. He lunged, knocking Peggy down and tearing out her throat. He then tore at her abdomen and pulling out her intestines. Sadie sat stunned in the silence while Tank ripped her mother apart in front of her, eating her intestines ravenously. Sadie finally found her voice and emitted a loud, blood-curdling scream that would wake the dead. It did. Tank turned and growled at Sadie. She screamed again and Tank dove. There was a swift motion from the door that intercepted Tank before his impact with Sadie. All she heard was a very loud "Run!" as Dad tackled Tank to the ground. Tank and Mike fought for the supremacy in a life-and-death battle where there could only be one outcome. Mike had charged into the room without any weapons, expecting to be battling another human, not the family pet. And he was a gentle giant at that. He had the snarling beast in a headlock and was struggling for time while Sadie ran from the house. Then he saw Peggy, ripped open and resembling a bag of discarded sausages. Mike became scared and was growing into a rage. He choked harder, praying for Tank to either pass out or die. Tank began to weaken as Mike also was struggling to maintain his strength. Tank slumped under Mike's arms. Then he stopped struggling and finally lay limp. Mike released the animal and let him collapse onto the floor. Mike grabbed a chair, uprighted it, and climbed up and sat down. This took everything he had. He called 911. "This is Officer Mike Milligan. I need a bus and an animal control. My dog just went Cujo on my family. He is either unconscious or dead. My daughter is outside and safe." Mike hanged up the phone and went to retrieve a service revolver. When he returned, Tank was gone. He looked around, not finding the animal. He cocked his pistol and began to look for Tank. He performed a textbook room-by-room search, clearing each room by closing the door as he left. His technique was flawless, or so he thought. Covering every angle of his field of vision, pulling the door closed behind him, he had cleared all of the rooms downstairs and had just placed his foot on the top landing when he heard Tank's labored breathing with a guttural growl of warning. Mike turned and was met with 65 pounds of terminal velocity as Tank dived for him from the table that sat on the backside of the stairwell. He was forced off balance, discharged around from his .38 as his hand smashed against the wall. The weapon, now free of Mike's grip, tumbled down the stairs just ahead of the battling duo as they tangled in a mass of bodies. Only this time, Tank had the upper hand. Landing head first, Mike heard the bone-chilling chunk as his neck snapped just below his skull as his body landed in a heap at the bottom of the stairs. Mike, now powerless to defend himself, was being rolled like a large doll as Tank tore at his stomach. He felt an odd sensation of being pulled and tugged around his body, but did not feel any pain. He could see Tank, the once gentle giant, bobbing up and down like he was playing tug-of-war. He felt the numbing tug at his body when something wet slapped against his face and rolled over one eye. It was red and pink. Tank ate noisily as Mike's vision faded as he died. Officer Tom Strader returned home and pulled a beer from the refrigerator. He rolled it over his face and pressed it against each side of his neck. He opened the can and drained half of its contents before placing it on the counter. He pulled out a bottle of scotch and placed it on the counter next to the beer. Tom had been on the force for 20 years and was looking at his golden pen and pencil set, a nice card, a few pats on the back, and a sweet, well-deserved pension. He was going to move to Florida and love on the beach, avoiding all but who he might find interesting. But of his 20 years, he had seen too many scenarios. When he was alone where he could think, he drank heavily. He also lived in a less than desirable neighborhood to save his money for retirement. Those in the area knew Tom and gave him a very wide berth. But tonight was going to place him on the couch until he retired. He knew that. Cats just do not disembowel humans, which was just unacceptable. But there it was, forever burned into his retinas. He unscrewed the cap from the scotch and took 3 long pulls. He removed his bottle of painkillers from his pocket and pulled 2 from his plastic confines. Tom popped them into his mouth, chasing them with the rest of the open beer. He made a sandwich, but was only able to eat a little before he felt nausea set in. He took the bottle of scotch and walked over to where his wore-out couch that he bought at the thrift store. He sat down heavily and rolled his head around, finally laying it back over the back of the couch. By the time Tom passed out, he had consumed 2 painkillers, 1 20-ounce beer, 3/4 of a bottle of cheap scotch. He would be out until at least tomorrow. If he was lucky, he would be out for 2 days. Tom's decision to live in a seedy, low-rent, mouse and roach-infested apartment would prove to be his downfall. As he slept, a scout roach ventured forth to look for food. The roach foraged all over the couch, not finding as much as a stray crumb, but it smelled food. It climbed up the couch and up Tom's collar. It found a small crumb, but smelled a strong odor of food. Up the neck and over his chin, the odor was now overpowering. It hypnotized the insect. It made a noise, calling all the others that could hear it. Tom was in that deep sleep with the drool meter at full flow. The roach found some food in the drool. It drank and ate. Others had heard and saw the success in the quest for food and followed suit. They were becoming aggressive in their competing for the food. They began to attack one another. A few others were pushing at his mouth, and his lips opened up with him inhaling hard, aspirating 2 of the roaches deep into his mouth. Tom coughed twice and began snoring heavily. Within minutes, all the roaches were aggressive. They were biting Tom to form openings in his flesh. Several were made, and more roaches came to the party. Soon, Tom's skin crawled with movements beneath the skin. It appeared as though more openings that were torn in his flesh, the more roaches appeared in the room. His blood acted as an attractor or lure. Several roaches discovered the money shot. Blood began to spray from every wound as his ruptured heart pumped his blood from his body. Tom was so drunk and high from the painkillers and booze that he never woke. It was both a curse and a blessing in Tom Strader's case. He had become one of his own nightmares, but now a nightmare for someone else to look upon. Tom had few to no friends. He also had a habit of not showing up for work for 4 or 5 days at a time. So when 9 a.m. rolled around the next morning, it would be no surprise when Tom Strader was not at roll call. The roaches, however, ate as if it were the last meal they would ever get. These nature's little disposals devoured every morsel of internal organ in Tom's body. Some found their own passage to his brain. Within hours, the former human being known as Tom Strader was nothing more than an empty meat casing coated with a severely damaged layer of skin. By the time they would discover his body, the skin would become distorted and shrunken leather. Officer Taylor Smith was young and impetuous, and a hardcore dedicated officer of the Franklin PD. He was the most and highest decorated officer of anyone remotely close to his age. He felt ill after the bite. Taylor was afraid for many reasons. First and foremost were the possibilities of rabies. Granted, there was no obvious infection, blood poisoning, or anything that could remotely make him sick. Taylor instantly became something of a hypochondriac. He isolated himself from everyone and everything. His house, located on the Upper East Side, was impeccably clean, bug-free, and since he was gone so much, pet-free as well. Taylor took his meds and curled up with a very heavy blanket, an electric blanket, and a cup of tea. Whatever he had, he would fight it. With his phone close by, he was determined to control this, as he did every aspect of his life. He turned the blanket to high and sipped some tea and dozed off. He slept deep and troubled. 14 hours later, Taylor awoke to the sounds of his cell phone ringing. He shed the soaked linens that he had wrapped up in and checked the display. He flipped open the phone and held it to his ear. "Hello?" he asked. "Smith?" came from the other end. Yeah, who's this? He said into the digital wireless device. Are you okay? This is Patterson. We haven't been able to reach Milligan all day. Can you come in? Patterson said. Strader didn't show up either, but he's been doing that a lot lately. I guess so. I was feeling ill earlier, but I feel fine now. I'll be there shortly, he said. Great. Report directly to the sergeant, Patterson said. He has a job for you. Okay, Taylor replied. Taylor sat up and thought, Mike not show up for work? That's not at all like him. Taylor showered and felt like a new man. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like he'd been rebuilt. He was reaching 35 and felt like he was 18 again. He closed his front door and turned to see a large gathering of animals around his house. He unlocked the door, went right back inside, and called the station, then animal control. Where's the dog bound up? The dispatcher said. Dogs, plural. Cats, plural. Squirrels, possums, and rabbits, plural, Taylor said nervously. Sir, you need to call 911 for a mental or medical emergency, the dispatcher began to say until Taylor cut her off. I am Officer Taylor Smith of the Franklin Police Department. I have already called in my situation. Send someone to verify if you don't believe me, Taylor said. Sir, please calm down. I'll send a truck out to pick up the animal in question. Now just stay inside and you won't be hurt. I'm sure there's not as many animals as you think there are, the dispatcher said. Look, I'll take it. Just make sure to send someone yesterday, he said as he looked out the window. He called his lieutenant back, only to be told that a unit was on its way. It would be up to an hour before it got there. Is there anything I can do until they get there? The lieutenant said. Yeah, bring a couple pallets of milk-bone dog biscuits, Taylor replied. Is it really that bad? Sir, have you ever known me to be wary of an animal? Taylor asked. Nope. Can you estimate how many animals are out there? He asked. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Just show up yourself, Taylor said. Okay, I'm on my way. Hang tight, he said and broke the connection. He never saw or even heard Taylor rattle before, but this had him rattled hard. He donned the hip holster and slid 9mm home. He left his office just to see what had one of his best men afraid to leave his own house. As he drove, Lieutenant Hamilton was running through the past 24 hours. The man with the 6 cats that ate all the internal organs of Zach. 3 of his men had been bitten, all 3 complaining of pain and feeling like a cold or flu were coming on. Now 2 were unaccounted for and 1 pinned in by animals. Bizarre was a word that first came to mind. Several other words flashed through his mind until he was a block away. There weren't 1 or 10 animals. It seemed like hundreds. His yard was full of animals of all sorts. They all sat staring at Taylor's house. He grabbed the radio and called dispatch with several animal control units and gave the address. He then grabbed his cell phone and called Taylor. Hello? Taylor answered. What the hell are you cooking? You've got to have every stray in town here in your front lawn. I can't even get within half a block of your house, the lieutenant said. Is this crazy or what? Taylor said. Are you having a kibble BQ? Hamilton chuckled. Not laughing, LT, he quipped. Sit tight. We're waiting on animal control, Hamilton said, terminating the call. He wanted to get out and walk up to them, but was cautious on whether they would be friendly or aggressive. This was definitely something out of a science fiction movie. Why only here? They cared less about the other houses, only Taylor's house. He put the cruiser in drive and eased forward. The animals seemed focused on the house. He bumped into the first animal, which was a medium-sized dog. The dog turned as if broken from a trance and walked away. He progressed about 10 feet when he saw a lone animal control truck appear on the opposite side of the street. He didn't bother to get out. Instead, Hamilton saw him get on his radio. Dispatch called him over the radio and gave him the animal control's phone number. He dialed. Animal Control, Officer Barnes, he said. Barnes, Lieutenant Hamilton here. You ever seen anything like this before? No. This has the makings of an Alpo or some other animal food commercial. What the hell did the guy cook? He asked. Nothing. I don't know if they're going to prey to him or prey on him. I hope you called some reinforcements, Hamilton said. I called in everything we have. With this mini, it's no tag, no chip, automatic chamber. Actually, we have a few college guys who are taking all we have for some experiment. I think they're going to hit the jackpot. I'll call them, Barnes said. But I can see the weather is about to change, listeners. Next time, I hope you remember to bring some leather gloves and some high-top leather boots. I don't think we'll need them, but you never know. I hope you enjoyed the first episode of Zombie Critters. I've taken some licensing to accommodate the geographical layout of the area, so please don't send me emails and letters telling me that I don't know about the area. The music is from a band called 3 C's and an E, and the track is called Under the Weather. Thank you for listening.